These days, I hear from a lot of young guys who are really struggling. And I mean, really struggling not with something light, not with something light, just something they can just shake off, but with something that's gripping them hard, porn addiction. It's become one of the most common things I get messages about. Thousands of DMs, emails, comments, they all say a version of the same thing: I can't stop. Some of these guys are just teenagers. Some are in their 20s or early 30s. A few are older. But the vast majority of them are young, and they're reaching out with this quiet desperation in their words, not always dramatic, but deeply honest. And you can hear the pain in the way they talk about it. They're not even trying to justify it or make it sound less serious than it is. They're saying it plainly: I hate this, I don't want to keep doing it, but I can't seem to quit. That's where they're at. What strikes me the most is how much shame and confusion they carry. They're not enjoying it anymore, and that's really important to understand. This isn't about indulgence or pleasure. For many of them, it stopped being enjoyable a long time ago. What they're dealing with now is compulsion. They're watching something they don't even want to see anymore. They're caught in a loop. And that's where the suffering lies, not just in what they're doing, but in the fact that they feel powerless to stop it. And I sit with that for a moment every time I read a message like that. I think about how lucky I was that I didn't grow up with that kind of access. It wasn't on phones, it wasn't constantly available. I think if it had been, I probably would have struggled too. Who knows? Because we're all wired for reward, we're all vulnerable to that loop. It's not about weakness. It's about what this does to the nervous system over time. So when someone asks, why can't I stop? They're not being dramatic. They're describing a real pattern, a real neurological cycle. And you can hear the weight in their voices, even through text. You can feel it. It's not fake. And the heartbreaking part is they often feel like they're the only ones going through it. Like they've got some unique moral failure. Like this is a them problem, not a human problem. But it is a human problem. It's more common than we think, and it's getting worse. You combine instant access with the brain's natural reward system, and you've got a perfect storm. I think part of the reason these guys reach out is because they've never had anyone say to them, hey, you're not crazy. You're not broken. This is something real, and it's happening to a lot of people. And when they hear that even in a podcast or a short video, something shifts. You can see it in the way they respond. There's a little bit of hope that creeps in. Not because the problem is solved, not yet, but because they're finally being seen. Someone's naming the thing that they've been afraid to say out loud. That's the first crack in the wall. That's the first moment where something new can begin. You are not broken. You are human. And this thing you're facing, it's not unbeatable. The thing people don't always realize about pornography is how powerfully it impacts the brain, and not in some abstract, philosophical way, but in a very real, biological, and measurable way. This isn't just about willpower or morality. What we're talking about here is a deeply entrenched reward system response. You introduce a stimulus, in this case, porn, and the brain responds by releasing dopamine, a neurochemical that plays a major role in motivation, pleasure, and reinforcement. But when that stimulus is accessed frequently and without boundaries, the system starts to adapt in ways that are anything but healthy. And what happens over time is this: the same amount of stimulation no longer gives the same amount of satisfaction. This is classic tolerance. The brain becomes desensitized. It adjusts to the high levels of dopamine and says, okay, I need more now. So you go back, but now the old content doesn't quite hit. So you search for something more extreme, something more novel, something more intense. And the cycle keeps feeding itself. This is exactly how addiction loops form, not because someone is morally weak or lacks discipline, but because their brain is literally being rewired. In many ways, it mirrors the same patterns we see with substances like drugs or alcohol. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. There's data showing that repeated exposure to high dopamine stimuli like pornography can light up the same areas of the brain as cocaine. That's how serious this is. And yet, because it doesn't come in a bottle or a pill, people underestimate the power it has. But make no mistake, it's changing the way the nervous system functions, especially in developing brains. Now think about this in the context of a teenager or someone in their early 20s, someone whose brain is still forming, still pruning synapses, still trying to figure out how to regulate emotional and physical responses to the world. You put a dopamine spike like that into the system repeatedly, and the brain starts to prioritize it. It becomes a go-to, a shortcut, an escape, a fast hit of reward without effort, without vulnerability, without risk. But the problem is, the more you rely on that artificial reward, the less satisfying real-world rewards become. Things like real intimacy, connection, eye contact, even conversation, they start to feel dull or boring in comparison. It's not that they are inherently, it's just that the brain has been trained to expect more intensity, more novelty, more stimulation. So regular life starts to feel like it's not enough. And that's a dangerous place to be, because you're not broken, but your system is being told that natural experiences aren't valuable anymore. This is where a lot of the anxiety and shame I talked about earlier comes from. Guys are finding that in real life situations when they're with a partner, when they're trying to connect, they can't feel the same thing. Or worse, they feel disconnected, anxious, or numb. That's not a reflection of who they are. That's a reflection of how their brain has been conditioned. When your nervous system is trained to be a spectator of someone else's sexual experience, which is what porn is instead of being present in your own, the body gets confused. It doesn't know how to respond anymore, and this confusion builds on itself. You feel like something's wrong. You try to fix it the only way you know how, by going back to the thing that gave you the stimulation in the first place. And that just deepens the groove in the circuitry. It becomes a loop. You're chasing a hit that keeps giving you less and costing you more. One of the patterns I've seen over and over again in conversations around pornography addiction is how it slowly begins to alter a person's perception of intimacy in real-life relationships. It's subtle at first. It doesn't announce itself with sirens, but over time it builds this quiet distortion, a warping of how connection is felt, understood, and experienced. And for many of the guys who've reached out, especially the younger ones, that distortion becomes the new baseline. They don't even realize how much their expectations around closeness and emotional connection have shifted until they find themselves. See, when someone is consistently engaging with porn, it's not just about sexual gratification. It becomes a kind of surrogate for intimacy, a place where there are no emotional demands, no rejection, no vulnerability. It gives the illusion of closeness without any of the effort or risk, and the nervous system adapts to that. The mind begins to associate arousal not with connection, but with detachment, with watching rather than being seen, with control rather than surrender. And here's where it gets more complex. The more that fantasy-based engagement becomes normalized, the more anxiety people feel in real face-to-face intimacy. A real partner isn't scripted. A real interaction involves unpredictability. There's a rhythm, a back and forth that requires presence. But when the brain has been conditioned through repetition to experience sexual arousal as a one-sided, visual interaction, the nervous system starts to struggle when it's suddenly asked to participate. It's like trying to run a marathon when all you've done is watch running videos. You might understand the motion intellectually, but your body's just not ready for it. So what happens? You get performance anxiety. You get emotional withdrawal. You start doubting yourself, wondering why this doesn't feel right, why it feels harder to connect, why you're disconnected even when someone's right there with you. The moment where you should feel closest to someone suddenly becomes loaded with pressure, fear, and confusion. And that just loops right back into avoidance, back into the world where it's easier, where no one sees you, where you don't have to be vulnerable. And the thing is, most people don't talk about this. They carry the weight of that disconnection in silence. They think something's wrong with them, that they're broken. But they're not broken. They're just wired in a way that's no longer aligned with human connection. And I really believe that understanding this is crucial, because once you see that it's conditioning, that it's a learned pattern rather than some flaw in your character, you can start to make changes. You can start to unlearn what porn taught you about sex, about intimacy, about what it means to be close to another human being. It takes work, no question. It takes being honest with yourself, and often it means opening up to someone else, a therapist, a group, even a trusted friend. But that shift is possible. And when it starts to happen, when people begin to reclaim their ability to feel real connection, to be present, to touch and be touched, emotionally and physically, something deep inside starts to heal. Because that's what we're wired for. That's what the nervous system ultimately craves, not stimulation, not escape, but presence. Real, grounded, mutual presence. That kind of healing doesn't come from avoiding shame. It comes from facing it with compassion and then choosing something better, something real, something human. What I've found to be one of the most important things when it comes to any compulsive behavior, whether it's addiction to pornography, alcohol, or even just unhealthy patterns of thinking, is understanding how our brains get conditioned over time. And one of the most powerful forces behind that conditioning is dopamine. Dopamine isn't just the pleasure chemical people think it is. It's really more about motivation, about seeking, about craving. It drives us to repeat the behaviors that gave us a hit of it. The more frequently we chase those highs, especially if they come quickly and with little effort, the more our brain starts to expect and demand them. When someone engages with porn over and over again, what they're really doing on a neurochemical level is reinforcing that loop. I think one of the biggest challenges people face when trying to break free from a porn addiction is the presence of shame. And it's not just the behavior itself, it's the secrecy around it, the silence, the isolation. That's where shame thrives. With substances like alcohol or drugs, there's a social narrative. We see stories of people hitting rock bottom and recovering, and often we admire them more for it. There's space for compassion in those stories. But with pornography, the stigma is different. People don't talk about it in the same way. And because of that, those who are struggling often feel like they're uniquely broken, like they're the only ones going through it. The irony is that the shame, the silence, the secrecy, that's what keeps people stuck. There's a saying I really believe in: you're only as sick as your secrets. It shapes your identity in a very destructive way. You begin to believe that you're not just someone who has a problem, you become the problem. That shift in self-perception is incredibly harmful, because once you start to think, this is just who I am, it becomes harder and harder to believe that you can change. And this is why conversations, real, honest conversations, are so important, not performative ones. Not virtue signaling, but vulnerable human conversations. Being able to say to someone, this is something I'm struggling with, without being met with judgment or disgust, can be life-changing. It cracks the door open just enough to let light in. It allows healing to start. Because at the root of every addictive behavior is a wound. There's something underneath the compulsion, some form of pain, loneliness, trauma, or emotional disconnection. And you can't even begin to address that root issue if you're too buried under shame to admit the surface level problem. I've seen people wrestle with this for years, not because they lacked willpower, not because they didn't care, but because they had nowhere to put their shame, nowhere to process it. So they stayed silent. And when you're silent, you stay alone. When you're alone, the behavior continues. And then you feel more shame, which drives more secrecy. It's a brutal cycle. And it's one that doesn't start to break until someone feels safe enough to speak. Sometimes that happens with a therapist, sometimes in a support group, sometimes it starts with just writing something down. But the key is that first crack in the silence, that small moment of honesty. And I get it, it's not easy. Our culture doesn't exactly invite open dialogue about this. But that doesn't mean it isn't needed. In fact, it's needed more than ever. Especially with younger generations growing up in an environment where this kind of content is hyper accessible, where the pressure to be perfect and connected digitally is so high, and yet so many feel deeply disconnected. They're being trained to hide, to curate, to manage impressions. And when something like porn addiction enters the picture, it doesn't fit that curated image. So it goes underground. But healing doesn't happen underground. It happens in community, in connection, in truth. If you're struggling with this, or if someone you care about is, the most important step isn't perfection, it's honesty. It's being willing to say, I don't want to carry this alone anymore, because you don't have to. You were never meant to. One of the hardest parts about dealing with any kind of addiction is the feeling of being trapped in a cycle that you can't break out of. And when it comes to porn addiction, that cycle often feels especially isolating because it's tied up with so much shame and secrecy. What I see time and again is that people don't just struggle with stopping the behavior itself, they struggle with how to move forward afterward, how to create a new life that doesn't revolve around those old habits. That process of breaking free isn't just about willpower, it's about building a new foundation, one that supports healthier patterns and creates space for growth. It starts with awareness, really knowing when and why the behavior happens. Most people think of addiction in terms of cravings or urges, but often those urges are triggered by something deeper. It might be boredom, anxiety, loneliness, stress, or even specific situations that unconsciously cue the behavior. So the first step in recovery is learning to recognize those triggers and patterns. That awareness isn't about self-judgment or shame, it's about gathering information, becoming curious about your own behavior. Once you understand what's leading you into that space, you can start to make choices that interrupt the cycle. But awareness alone isn't enough. You need to replace the old habit with something new, something healthier. And this is where it gets really personal. What works for one person won't work for another. For some, it might be physical activity, going for a run, lifting weights, or practicing yoga. For others, it might be creative outlets like writing, music, or painting. The key is to find something that engages your body and mind in a way that's meaningful to you, something that brings satisfaction and fulfillment without triggering the same dopamine spikes that porn does. Another crucial element is community. Recovery at its best happens with support. That might look like therapy, a 12-step group, or a trusted friend or mentor who holds you accountable without judgment. Having someone to talk to, someone who understands the struggle and can remind you of your worth and progress, can make all the difference. It's hard to face addiction alone because it thrives in isolation. Connection weakens its grip. Technology can also be a tool or a trap, depending on how it's used. These days, porn is so accessible that it can feel impossible to avoid. But there are practical steps people can take: software filters, accountability apps, or even changing daily routines to reduce the chance of exposure. This isn't about policing yourself forever, but about creating boundaries that help you regain control while you rebuild healthier habits. What really stands out to me when talking about overcoming addiction, whether it's to pornography or anything else, is how essential it is to understand that this isn't just about individual willpower or moral strength. Addiction, by its nature, rewires the brain's reward system, creating habits so ingrained that stopping them requires more than just wanting to quit. It demands a comprehensive approach that includes support, accountability, and often professional help. One of the key elements here is therapy. Working with a therapist who understands addiction and the unique challenges of pornography addiction can be transformative. Therapists can help individuals identify the underlying causes and triggers behind their addiction. Because often porn use isn't the root problem itself, it's a coping mechanism for deeper issues like anxiety, depression, trauma, or loneliness. Without addressing those root causes, it's like trying to fix a leak without repairing the pipe. Therapy provides a space to explore these difficult emotions and experiences, to build healthier coping strategies, and to develop a stronger sense of self. That sense of self is so important because addiction tends to erode self-esteem and self-worth over time. Another important tool is support groups, particularly those based on the 12-step model or similar frameworks. These groups offer not only accountability but also community. When you're in a group of people who truly understand what you're going through, there's a sense of connection and belonging that can be incredibly healing. Addiction often makes people feel isolated and different, but hearing others share their struggles and successes helps normalize the experience and reduce shame. Plus, having a sponsor or accountability partner can provide practical guidance and encouragement on days when motivation is low. There's also the role of technology in recovery. Being harsh or judgmental toward oneself only adds to the shame and makes it harder to keep going. Learning to treat yourself with kindness, understanding that you're working through complex neurobiological patterns can make a huge difference in long-term success. It's important to remember that sobriety or recovery doesn't necessarily mean eliminating all sexual expression or intimacy. It means creating healthy, balanced relationships with those parts of life. Defining what sobriety looks like is personal, and working with a therapist or support group can help clarify that. Some people find they need complete abstinence from porn to feel well, while others may develop boundaries that allow for healthy sexual activity without triggering old patterns. What I emphasize is that recovery is a multifaceted journey. It requires honesty with yourself, commitment to change, and often leaning into a community of support. But the brain is remarkably plastic, and with consistent effort, those old circuits driving compulsive behaviors can be rewired. New habits form, new relationships flourish, and new ways of living emerge. You're not alone in this, and you don't have to do it alone. Taking that first step to admit there's a problem, to reach out for help, is often the hardest. But it's also the most powerful, because from that moment forward, you're reclaiming control over your life. You're stepping into a future where you're not defined by addiction, but by growth, resilience, and connection. If you found yourself in this message, if something in you stirred while listening, don't just scroll away. Take one action, one small step. Look up a group, block a site, talk to someone you trust. Because the real you, the one who knows this isn't how your story ends, that version of you is still there, waiting, wanting more. And I promise life on the other side is bigger, brighter, and more connected than you've ever known. Your healing starts now. Choose to begin.